In an obsidian room of chandeliers and hush, a bottle of red wine decided the shape of Elena Vancova's life. She had been balancing 2 plates and 6 polite steps when the seam of her apron snagged on the lip of a carved chair. The glass slipped from a waiter's tray like a small comet, spilled across the linen like a dark confession, and found the white of Isabella Thorne's couture dress. For an instant there was only the sound of crystal cracking the silence, a clean, brutal note, and then the room exhaled in 1,000 small, practiced insults. Isabella's face did not redden with anger so much as cool into a currency of disdain. Her hand flew to the stain with a decisiveness that read like a verdict. Around her, the table's voices tightened into invisible cuffs. Elena felt the air change. Oxygen thinned where money had weight, and everyone around the Thorne table knew how to value leverage. "Girls like you always have accidents," Isabella said, crisp as a banknote. The words landed like stones. Elena's stomach folded over itself. She muttered apologies. Her voice had the soft, unused quality of someone who had been taught to disappear. The servers looked at one another, at the ruined gown, and then at the mistakes that had cost it. Julian Blackwood sat 2 seats over, a pillar of composure in a suit cut to precision. He watched the scene, and Elena, with a curiosity that was not quite kind. Julian's world was built on the calculus of advantage. A wrong move could be turned into leverage, an embarrassment could be turned into spectacle, and spectacle could be turned into currency. He watched the woman with the tired eyes, a rawness in her face that suggested more than the apron she wore could ever explain. "Sing this Mozart aria perfectly," he said, turning the sheet of music he had plucked from the table as though from a deck of playing cards, "and I'll marry you." The room hummed. Not a single laugh, but the sound of expectations tightening. People expected opulence from billionaires, not wagers of that caste. It was a dare disguised as a gentleman's whim, disruptive, elliptical, cruel in its elegance. The line traveled from table to table like an animal scent. Elena stared at him. The music on the page was a blur to everyone else, an elegant curve of notes that meant nothing in that bright, arrogant dining room. To her, it looked like home. Once, when the world had been less complicated, Elena had lived inside notes. The conservatory had smelled of varnished wood and sun through high windows. Her fingers had learned to coax air into order. Her life had once been a ledger written in scales. The memory of those years sat behind her sternum like an unread letter. Someone had taken it all, her name rewritten, her promise shorn, and afterward she had learned economy. She spoke in small, efficient phrases. She moved through rooms like a shadow. She kept Leo's world spinning.
"Do it," Isabella said with the sort of bored malice rich people reserve for entertainment. Cameras were metamorphosing into devices that recorded everything now. The Thorne table had 2 on the table, glued to their phones, not for news, but for the pleasure of watching someone else be diminished. Elena felt the first flare of something hot and terrible, a shame rage that had the clarity of pain. Pride rose like a tremor beneath her ribs. She did not own the room, she reminded herself. The room had never been hers, but the sound in her throat answered before thought could conjure consent. It was an old habit, one that had once filled halls. She cleared her throat. The staff hushed. The light seemed to lean closer. She sang. The first measure was a small defiance. Her vowels landed with an authority that bent the chandelier's glitter into focus. The Mozart aria, Laudate Dominum, a fragment of something they all presumed they knew, left her lips like a hand reaching across a gulf. The note rose, a bright, uncompromising high F that cut through the low murmur of wealth. The room, full of people who measured grief in headlines and profit in reputations, was pierced by something none of them had purchased, a voice. Silence followed, deep enough that Elena could hear the blood in her own ears. Then, as the last phrase fell, the sound of 1,000 small movements. Phones lifted, breath hitched, someone dropped a fork. The arrogance that had surfaced a moment before looked suddenly and embarrassingly slight. A video lit up in pockets around the room. The clip's first frame would later be replayed in feeds across the city. A woman in a white apron, head lifted, a small smear of red visible on the tablecloth, singing like someone claiming back their first language. Julian didn't stand. He watched as if cataloging proof. There was something almost clinical in the way he watched, an archivist noting an anomaly in a dataset. But behind that eye of scrutiny, a subtlest shift occurred, like a dark glass beginning to warm. The music had done something to him too. It had punctured his practiced removal. Elena fled before applause could come. She needed distance from the heat of eyes. In the back of the restaurant, the alley smelled of citrus trash and exhaust. She wrapped her hands around the cold metal of a dumpster and let her shoulders drop. Her heart thudded magma hot against her ribs. A clip, 40 seconds of astonishment, moved through the internet like a marble unmoored. It would hit 1 million views before the train reached the next station. If that moment gave you chills, like the video and drop your city in the comments. The alley collapsed into the familiar clutter of her life. A third-floor walk-up whose windows looked onto the brick of another building, a shared radiator that clanked with the time of day, and a small couch where Leo slept in fits and sips of oxygen.
He slept with a child's tenderness, cheeks hollowed into the soft map of someone who had been stolen by illness. Elena had learned the economy of being two people. She banked the small moments of normalcy for him, a warm stew, a retied shoe, the slow coaxing to swallow medicine, and she thrived on the certainty of those tiny rolls more than anything else. The day after the clip, the apartment smelled of boiled coffee and the static of a city watching and waiting. A neighbor had left a message. "You are incredible. People are talking." Leo slid out of bed and watched her with the uneven eyes of someone who had become an island of needs. "You sang," he said, not a question. "I sang," she answered, and the words were thin and bright. He smiled, small and marred by lines she had not noticed until then. "You sounded like when you played the violin upstairs, before everything." The memory lay between them like a photograph. She told him nothing of the people calling, of the producers offering interviews, of the journalists who fingerprinted her life with intrusive questions. That night, they sat with the cheap radio and scrolled headlines in silence. Leo's illness was an ache that made the world strict. Every decision was measured against his survival, against the merciless arithmetic of medical bills. Elena's choices had been carved by that ledger for years. Each small deception, each avoided doctor, every freezing of pride for the price of another refill of his machine. She had learned to barter with herself. 2 days later, there was a knock at their door that sounded like a different kind of consequence. Julian Blackwood stood in the hallway like a man whose properties included space and permission. He wore the same unflappable expression that landed in headlines when the Blackwood Foundation purchased museums or acquired failing companies and turned them into empires. "I should have offered you a seat," he said, too bright, as if the hallway were merely a room, not the threshold between two worlds. He did not apologize for the wager. He didn't have to. He had set things in motion and now offered an answer in the form he knew best, a contract. His assistant, Ruth, whose presence was more like an old guard and less like valet, handed a packet that smelled faintly of leather and antiseptic. Julian had done his homework. He had not been the type to gamble on whims. He had watched the clip until pattern emerged. He had discovered Elena Vancova, a name returned to him from an old conservatory roster, a biography cut short by scandal. The internet had connected fragments, an admission to Juilliard at 17, scholarship recitals, a promissory arc interrupted by a rumor that had been manufactured to destroy her career. The rumor had been efficient. It had made Elena vanish. He proposed something in the measured corporate cadence he favored. 1 year, he said, a legal marriage of convenience, separate wings of the residence.
0 public intimacies enforced. Full control of finances allocated for your brother's medical care, with a trust established upon signature, a non-disclosure about the factual terms, and a publicity strategy that ensures your security while allowing you to perform as you wish. It arrived as prospect and as instrument. Julian's offer was a chess move. It had the clarity of a ledger, expenses covered, threats managed, cameras rerouted. He described the legal precision with an almost tender patience, as if data might soothe a human problem. Elena listened. Leo's name made the words crack in her mouth. "What do you want in return?" she asked. He smiled with the coolness of someone who had negotiated hostile takeovers and forgiven escheatments of ego. "You will be Elena Blackwood for public purposes. You will attend certain events, yes. Your voice will be an asset. In private, you will be protected. There will be boundaries. I will not demand affection. I will not ask for more than a year's cooperation. Why me?" The question came out smaller than a request for mercy. She felt ridiculous asking a thing like that. Why had he chosen her, of all the voices in a city?
Julian's eyes flicked away first, and in the movement she saw the shape of a man who catalogued anomalies like rare books. "You sang," he said simply, "and you did not know who you were performing for." He could have been saying anything. She could not afford to romanticize why a man like Julian would choose to invest his power in her life. The offer had leverage, of course, but it also pried a door that had been sealed for too long. Elena could have declined. She could have kept the pride of the woman who had been taught to survive without promises. She could have taken interviews, made a living of the clip. But the clip would not pay for Leo's medications the way Julian's trust could. The clip did not guarantee access to the network of specialists who might keep him alive. Pride, she had learned, did not keep sheets clean or oxygen flowing. Survival did. She negotiated. It was not a small exchange of lines on a contract, but it was an assertion of terms that cared for the things people always forgot: consent as a lived set of conditions. Her signature would not be mere acquiescence, but a calculated move. She insisted on separate wings. She demanded a clause that barred Julian from exploiting her image for anything beyond a great events for the year. She required, with the stubbornness of someone who had been stripped before, that the trust supporting Leo would be irrevocable and managed by an independent trustee of her choosing. She asked for medical oversight, for privacy, for assurances that the Blackwood security team would not use her past as fodder. Julian nodded, sometimes impatient, sometimes impressed. Ruth, who had not spoken much, admired her for that quiet ferocity. Arthur, Julian's head of security, raised an eyebrow and penciled notes.
Contracts, Julian believed, were a way to make the fragile durable. For a man who believed in systems, it was the only language that felt like a promise. 1 year, the contract repeated. No required intimacy, separate finances for household expenses. Lines of legalese turned human limits into ink. She signed. The act had the weight of a small coronation. It was not surrender. It was another form of strategy. The ceremony 3 days later was deliberately unspectacular. They married in a clerk's office, behind frosted glass, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly more ordinary. The photographer who hovered produced a photo that would be used years later in narrative arcs to justify power. Smiling couple, nonchalant. But in the fluorescent glow, it felt like a document, a signature placed with the kind of deliberation that had become familiar. Leo was not present. The hospital rules were strict, and his fragility was not a public prop. Elena kissed his cheek and promised, in a voice that had all the edges knitted tight, that this was for him. Moving into Julian's tower was a study in new rules. The elevator smelled of lemon cleaner and new money. The penthouse rose above the city like an obelisk of glass. Elena felt the architecture of wealth press against her cheeks. She had, for so long, lived in a world where survival was improvised. Here, everything had been designed to function without her having to ask. A line of staff introduced themselves by names she had to practice as if learning notes again. Ruth showed her which buttons called for certain lights, for which rooms were considered off-limits, for where the piano lived, unplayed, like a relic. The penthouse was broken into geometries of glass and shadow. One wing would be hers, nominally separate. The other would be Julian's functional world, a place of strategy meetings and cases of wine Julian never drank. For a woman who had once practiced scales until her knuckles ached, the grand piano in the music room was an object both terrifying and intimate. Ruth said very little but watched Elena with a steady, pragmatic patience that felt like shelter. Julian was less a sovereign and more a curator of control. He explained with the absence of grand gestures how the PR would move, what insiders would say, and how to avoid trapdoors. He did not make promises of love. He did not attempt to charm. He was relentless in his focus on outcomes. And yet, when Elena touched the piano keys for the first time in years and coaxed a hesitant, simple phrase from the instrument, Julian paused in the doorway. He did not look away. The expression on his face was unreadable, but it registered. It was as if a long-buried ledger had come scrawled back to life in a hand he wanted to understand.
She began to submit to the theater of it with the same pragmatic cadence she had used to schedule Leo's treatments, performances at charity events, photo shoots under controlled light, the occasional humanizing clip released to feeds with a message written by Julian's communications team and approved by her. She worked to shape the narrative she allowed into being. It was a strange kind of choreography. Her voice, once private, was now an instrument balanced on a scale between acclaim and vulnerability. But the city is a too loud machine, and enemies are patient. Harold Thorne, patriarch of a family whose social maps included every elevator in Manhattan, observed from his oxygen of power with the kind of amusement one had only at other people's misfortunes. Isabella watched from a safe distance, lips a slash of approval. The Thorne family had people who could make reputations vanish and reappear with different captions. A smear is an art form. Harold had long practiced it like a hobby. The wine stain had been a pretext. What followed felt almost like a script,
calculated leaks, a suggestion that Elena was thirsty for spectacle, a circulated photograph of Leo near an unmarked vehicle, and another of Elena with a minor producer whose name suggested impropriety. Julian anticipated some retaliation. He called Arthur and said the word surveillance and the word harassment in a sentence that made Elena narrow her eyes. She had been watched before, and watchfulness in men of power had once been the instrument that destroyed her career. Arthur's team trawled. What they found was precise and the kind of quiet. Shadowed images of Leo's dialysis clinical visits circulated to a tabloid, an anonymous tip to a charity board questioning her motives. The campaign was not crude. Thorne's people were better artisans than that. They knew how to plant suppositions and let rumor do the work. Elena bristled. She refused to be refitted into the shape others tried to make for her. She was not a victim to be paraded, and she was not going to be silenced again. When the first smear reached the op-ed desks, a breathless piece that suggested she was harvesting sympathy, she sat in the music room with the window open and wrote, without Julian's counsel, a piece for a small arts publication. It was direct, raw, and it named things: rumor, fear, the way institutions weaponize noise to erase people. The piece did not dramatize illness. It simply said facts where rumor had been allowed to pretend. The op-ed was a pivot. It was a piece of public strategy that she had authored with the careful anger of someone reconnecting with a voice she had thought borrowed. It read like a salve. It read like a warning. Julian was surprised to read it. Surprise is a rare emotion in him. He was more inclined to expect calculations to lead to predictable payoffs. This was unpredictability carved into protest.
That was dangerous, he told her once, handing her a glass of water with an unease that looked almost perversely like concern. It was necessary, she said. Dangerous does not cost me Leo's life. He watched her as if trying to understand cost calculus he had not been trained to measure. For the first time, the transactional model that defined his world showed a spline, a place where affection might connect with action. He admired, privately, the way she converted humiliation into something strategic. She was not simply weathering a storm, she was commanding it. Her voice was weapon and shield, and Julian was beginning to see that his ledger of strategies had a new unit of value: agency. The clip that had made her household a minor sorcery now animated a broader public. Musicians who had been inspired by her conservatory work sent messages. A former teacher, Marie Hensley, reached out through an intermediary. The message contained fragments of Elena's past, but also, more crucially, the possibility of accounts and witnesses to how her career had been tempered. Marie's note contained the kind of soft whistle of a person who had once been inside a system and had burned to watch what it did to talent. Yet the city did not revert to instant justice. The Thorne family pushed back with the extraordinary machinery of PR, innuendo passed to sympathetic columnists, a curated set of images implying recklessness, anonymous whispers amplified by influencers. Elena felt the old terror of being footnoted into shame. But like any person who has learned to negotiate the logistics of survival, she had allies now. Ruth arranged security for Leo's appointments. Arthur tightened routes. Julian's legal team fed specifications into an engine of defensive strategy. There were small human things that no contract could guard. Leo had days when he woke with a fear so bright it was almost childish. He would ask if the people who had been watching his sister would come and take his future. Elena would lay her hand on his and sing low nonsense songs until the fear slinked away. Julian, watching from a distance, learned how to leave him alone when that was what Leo needed. It was only a small kindness, but it was the kind of thing that unspooled in the marrow of relationships. The months at the top of the city were a study in public theater. Elena performed at one benefit where chandeliers had been dimmed to avoid the glare of flashbulbs, and she sang something intimate and ancient that made an old patron weep in his soup. Camera angles were discussed with surgical precision. Every public moment was a negotiation of light and shadow. In private, she practiced scales in a room where the grand piano seemed to hold its breath, and Julian would sometimes stand in the doorway, his silhouette a hard-edged frame for something that had once been a promise, and now it felt like a possibility.
He would watch her touch the keys, as if watching someone mark time in a place he had not thought to look. And yet, outside their carefully staged life, the Thorne family had not given up. They tightened the screws in ways that made Elena flinch. A photograph of Leo outside a medical building found its way to a tabloid with a caption that suggested dependency and implied exploitation. It was a cruel, slow work. Make the public pity a wealthy man married to a sick woman's sister, then use the pity to question motives. Julian's lawyers prepared filings. The media leaned. Elena read the articles and felt old wounds open like cut glass. She responded not by retreating but by flipping the mirror. Instead of letting the Thornes define her, she asked for the stage of her own choosing. She partnered with a small nonprofit in Soho that would host a benefit under conditions she negotiated. Her set list, the composition of the audience, and a promise that a whistleblower would be invited to speak about corporate retaliation. It was a gamble. It was also a strategic pivot that felt like reclamation. Her voice, once a private treasure, would now be used publicly, not as a balm, but as testimony. Julian did not object. He recognized a tactic when he saw one. He calculated risk and adjusted the perimeter. Arthur's team tightened logistics. Ruth smoothed the edges. There were whispers that this was theatrical, that Elena sought to transform private pain into public spectacle. Those whispers made her angrier than scripts could explain. The Soho benefit was unlike anything she had done in years. It was not a mansion, and it was not a glossy, competitive charity gala. It smelled of bread and old stage curtains. The seats were not rosy with social capitals. They were populated by a mix of people, musicians, local activists, a few well-placed donors, and some friends who had not allowed the distance wealth imposed to keep them from doorways. She walked on stage like an animal remembering its cavern. The lights were softer than the charity stage lights had been. The musician who accompanied her was not a hired celebrity, but an old conservatory colleague who read music like a map. She picked a program that threaded Mozart with more modern fare. Laudate Dominum moved quietly into pieces that named loss, resilience, and the feeling of rooms that once belonged to you. The opening phrase of the set was a risk. She held the first note like an offering, and the room exhaled, as if relieved to be included in something unmanufactured. By the second aria, the crowd had stopped being an audience and had become a witnessing congregation. The applause that followed was not the thin courtesy of a wealthy table. It was a raw, honest surge. The reviews were not the kind that sell tabloids. Friends sent messages, strangers posted videos, and someone uploaded an entire set to a music forum with the caption, "She has come back."
Back at the penthouse, late that night, Julian told her, quietly and without their scripts, that he respected the way she had taken the public by the hair and pulled them like a bridle. "You turned a narrative into a platform," he said. She heard the approval in his voice, but there was also something warmer, an admiration that carried the ring of something like tenderness. He was changing, in small increments. He made tea for Leo sometimes, and the way he waited in the hall to be allowed into the hospital room felt like a patience that had learned to be human. He still strategized, his mind still mapped advantage, yet small fissures of curiosity and care had begun to unpattern the armor he wore. A pendant, an old brass charm in the shape of a broken music note, appeared on his desk one morning, the kind of token that carried small, private meanings. He had no grand speech prepared. He simply slid into the room and placed the pendant beside Elena's sheet music, saying, "For what you gave us tonight." She did not mistake the gift for salvation. It was a gesture. It weighed in the palm like something that might become a memory. It was, like most human things in their world, ambiguous. They had bought time with ink, with watches, with legal definitions. But the city breeds contest. The Thorne family would escalate. There would be more images, more insinuations. Ruth warned about subtle harassment, messages sent at odd hours, the car that followed a route too closely. Arthur set up alerts. Elena, who had spent years rehearsing the tones of resilience, felt an old shadow descend, the sense of being chosen and then punished for the choosing. On a chill morning in late autumn, when the wind smelled like newsprint and cold metal, a package arrived at the penthouse with no return address. Julian opened it without ceremony. Inside was a single folded photograph. It showed Elena and Leo walking in a park years ago, before the scandal, before they had become characters shaped by other people's stories. The photo had been taken at a distance, like evidence rather than memory, and someone had annotated the margins with a question. Who funds this? Where does the money come from? It was insinuation disguised as curiosity. Julian's jaw tightened. The photo was a line thrown in the water. For the first time, Elena saw fear in the man who had been the straight spine of their arrangement. It was a human thing, unacceptable and raw, and it made him more real to her than any calculated kindness had. "Harold Thorne," she said, naming a man whose influence ran like an underground river through institutions. "He will make a mistake," Julian answered. "A mistake that might cost us Leo," she countered. He did not answer immediately. He could not promise immunity against everything.
The contract had been clear. Protection could be bought and measures could be taken, but there was no perfect shielding from a family like the Thornes, who had practiced the art of social destruction with the patience of a priest. "Then we will be surgical," Julian said at last, and the word did not soothe. It was a weapon offered like a knife. Elena swallowed. The language of strategy was never absent from their lives now. She slept badly that night, with Leo's face like a small moon in the dark, and woke with the resolve that had made her sign her name in the clerk's office. The world she had entered was not one that would hold back. It would demand that she fight,
that she strategized not only for herself but for her brother. The things she had sung to win a moment of dignity had turned into the lever that would pry loose a closed system. She would not allow her voice to become a pawn. The line between public and private blurred more every day. There were late-night strategy meetings where lawyers and PR representatives argued about the ethics of counterleaks. There were quiet mornings when Julian would stand at a window, his coat still on, and listen to the city as if it were another instrument. He had begun to read Elena's pieces and to watch her perform without thinking of models or returns. He was not transformed overnight. He was being corrected over time by witness. Being in proximity to someone refusing erasure softened something in him. Summer ripened into an autumn that smelled of promises and threats. The next act was shaping itself. An op-ed that would name and name clearly. A benefit in Soho that would not simply raise funds, but would open doors for whistleblowers to tell their stories. The Thorne family had made their move. Elena, who had been hidden for years, was stepping into light with new armor. One built out of a voice reclaimed, a legal paper signed, and a brother's life finally protected. The camera had not been the end of the story, but the beginning. It had lit the match. What came after would be a negotiation between narrative and truth, between power and witness. Elena had bought time with a signature, but time was not a cure. It was a stage. She had come to terms with the fact that she would need to be not only a performer, but an architect of her own story. The penthouse's glass stretched away, a cathedral of wealth, reflecting a city with many voices. Elena stood at the window one afternoon, watching construction cranes stitch the skyline, and felt the old music rise. She touched the pendant Julian had given her, and thought of the song that had started it all, a Mozart aria given in an alley of shame, and turned into something like an opening. The note that had silenced a room had also opened an entire city to reconsider what it meant to be seen. Below, the news cycle had barely cooled.
Above, a man who made his life in risk calculations had offered a contract that could not absolve him of responsibility for the small human life he had bought access to. The arrangement was still an arrangement, the marriage still a tool. But for Elena, it felt like a theater in which she had finally been allowed to choose her lines. There would be more tests. Isabella would not let go of her amusement. Harold Thorne's machinery would continue to hum. The path to reclaiming what was taken would not be linear. It would require strategy, endurance, and the willingness to be visible in ways she had fled for years. That afternoon, she opened the piano and played. The room filled with sound, and for once, the city did not feel like something to fend off. It felt like a chorus learning to follow a new conductor. The note lingered in the penthouse like a small lighthouse. Elena's fingers trembled on the keys, then steadied, and the music poured out, part apology, part challenge, part a memory reclaimed. Julian stood in the doorway with his coat still on, listening as if the sound could rearrange facts. When the last chord dissolved into the glass of the room, neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the city went about its loud businesses. Inside, the music was a map. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the world, predictable, hungry, and always eager to file stories into neat columns, tightened its focus again. The next wave of press was surgical. A lifestyle site ran an anonymous exposé that suggested Elena's marriage was a maneuver to launder charity donations. A gossip column published an image of Leo being helped into a car with a caption that implied he was a prop. The insinuations were clever because they were never direct accusations. They were questions shaped like doubt. The Thorne machine had learned to plant the seed and trust the rumor to do the rest. This time the attacks were subtler, more poisonous. A whisper that Elena's trust would be mismanaged, a side piece hinting she had leveraged Leo's illness for sympathy, a feed of blurred images of the brothers' hospital visits. Elena recognized the pattern. It was always the same architecture: dehumanize, then profit from the fallout. She had been taught how to survive that architecture. She had not been taught how to dismantle it. But she had allies who were learning fast. At breakfast, Leo watched the news with the raw curiosity of someone who had no appetite for optics. Julian poured tea and left a small, unmarked envelope on the table. Inside, an old ticket stub from a chamber concert, the edges softened by age. He slid it toward Elena without flourish, as if offering a thing that needed no caption. It was the kind of quiet attention that began to mean more to her than any speech could. "We will not be bullied," Julian said later in his office.
where strategy looked like a map of chess moves annotated with legalese and risk ratings.
Arthur had set up a list of contingencies. Ruth had arranged for a new route to Leo's clinic that was deliberately mundane. Julian spoke of ways to respond that were legal, precise, and unshowy. He hated chaos. He preferred order. Elena listened and interjected terms that kept the humanity of their measures in view. "We will answer facts," she said, "not insinuation, and no countersmear that stoops to their level." He nodded. She had learned to set boundaries even inside a fortified life. The contract had never been a surrender. It had been a tool, and she used it. Her op-ed had already shown that a single, carefully placed voice could reorder attention. It had begun a small cascade. Musicians and former colleagues stepped forward, offering eyewitness accounts of the smear that had ended her conservatory trajectory. A studio teacher remembered the sudden leak of a manipulated photograph years ago. A former PR associate of the Thornes sent a private message, curiosity first, then the soft unspooling of someone who had grown tired of a life built on rumor. Marie Hensley arrived like a quiet storm. She was older than Elena, with a trace of rehearsed patience that comes from many years inside institutions. She had been at the conservatory when Elena arrived, an ally who had watched a bright student blink out under pressure, and then, years later, a Harvard-educated consultant who had worked briefly and reluctantly for the Thorne campaign. Marie did not make a spectacle of her confession. She brought files, emails with internal threats visible, calendar notations, an annotated invoice that connected a Thorne-affiliated firm to a cascade of leaks and payroll items. The documents were not cinematic. They were banal, and therefore damning. They showed intent. "You should be careful," Marie told Elena when they met in a small cafe near the Soho Hall, the music of the city pressed against the windows. "Harold Thorne builds plausible deniability. He pays junior operators to do dirty work so he can clean his hands. He never signs papers in blood. He leaves trails in paperclips and expense accounts." Elena folded her hands and listened. She had spent years learning what it meant to be made less than. Marie's presence changed the tone of the fight. It was no longer just a scramble for reputation, but a legal trail that could be followed. "Tell me everything," Elena said. "Everything that ties him in." Marie gave names, small procedural notes, and, most important, an offer she had not expected to make. "I can introduce you to someone from the inside, Mason Grant. He used to work in intelligence contracting. Now he does investigations. He hates bullies." Elena and Julian agreed to the meeting with a wariness that felt like ritual.
Mason arrived in a practical coat, his interview voice restrained. He carried a small folder of things he had gathered, phone records that showed coordinated calls, timestamps that put operatives near certain clinics at times matching the photographs that had been leaked. He did not talk about how he obtained everything. He talked about chain of custody. He handed over a packet, and Arthur's team annotated it in pencil, and then in legal red. "It's messy," Mason said. "These things rarely land in a single file. But this is enough to suggest pattern. Payments out, accounts to shell companies, a PR firm that appears to run both positive placements and black ops narratives. Someone at the top is picking up a tab." The files were the beginning of an arc that would change the balance of the public argument. They did not erase the smear. They gave Elena and the team something to hold on to, evidence that dissonance could be turned to resonance. The Soho benefit was scheduled the following month. Elena insisted on doing it on her own terms. This was not simply a spectacle to show she could sing. It was to be a platform for witnesses, a small but precise call for accountability. She refused a high-powered MC and chose instead an underground activist who had organized rallies for whistleblowers. The sound system was modest. The invitations were targeted. It would be photographed, yes, but not staged for glossy consumption. It would be a night for people to speak plainly. Julian watched the preparations with a combination of practical irritation and something softer, like pride shaped by surprise. He disliked inefficiency and the way raw emotion could upend a clean plan, but he stayed in the room when rehearsals ran long, leaning against a pillar, listening as if the music could teach him something he had not yet learned. The night of the benefit, the Soho Hall smelled of old wood and lemon cleaner. People arrived in warm, without pretense. Elena walked on stage with the posture of someone who has measured her limits and chosen to press them. Her voice that night felt both precise and weathered, a soprano that had learned to fold pain into phrasing. She began with the Mozart aria that had once done so much harm and so much good, but she arranged it differently, allowing rests that let the lyrics speak as much as the notes. Interleaved in the set were brief addresses by those who had been targeted by corporate retaliation.
People who had been edged out of careers over whisper campaigns, a former PR assistant who refused to be complicit. Marie came on stage at the back of the hall and read out names. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of invoices, of paid ghostwriters, of a firm that specialized in reputation engineering, and she cited a memo authorizing certain narrative placements keyed to the Thorne family's reputation management. The room shifted. Applause was cautious, then strong. Cameras rolled.
The event was being streamed on a dozen small channels within minutes. People in the audience held their phones up and did not look embarrassed. For once, the public gaze felt supportive rather than exploitative. Halfway through the night, a man who introduced himself only as a whistleblower, his voice modulated, his face obscured on camera, read a fragment of an internal Thorne email that referenced a containment protocol and named a series of targets. The language was corporate and clinical, and that was precisely the point. Power uses policy to justify cruelty. In the back of the hall, a photographer began to move through the crowd, capturing faces, friends, journalists, ordinary neighbors. The images would run the next day with headlines that framed the event not as scandal theater, but as civic witness. The room felt like a chorus that had found its voice. After the performance, a video went viral, a clip of Elena finishing an aria and then turning to the audience not with a practiced bow, but with a steady, open look. "My brother is alive because of the choices I make," she said into the mic, her voice raw but clear. "And if you have been taught to be silent because power told you to, I ask you to speak with us." The clip carried not the sheen of a PR release, but the small danger of truth. The response was swift, but not uniform. The Thorne family reacted with their customary mix of denial and redirection. Harold called a press conference in which he was magnanimous in his denunciation of hyperbole and radical narratives. Isabella posted a photograph in which she held a charity check, her smile calibrated for sympathy. The machine pressed on. But the seeds planted at Soho had roots. Journalists followed the memo Marie had cited, traced payments to shell companies, and began to ask questions in editorial rooms that rarely entertained them. A small paper in Queens ran an investigative piece linking a Thorne-associated firm to several information ops that had sought to humiliate rivals. The piece was cautious and detailed. It contained interviews, corroboration, and the sense that someone had finally noticed the pattern of behavior. The turning point came when a federal agency, prompted by a whistleblower complaint and a journalist's inquiries, opened an inquiry into the payments. The inquiry was not framed in the headlines as a headline-grabbing indictment. At first it was procedural, a quiet letter, a request for records. But in the world of power, quiet letters are lethal. They mean a machine must cough up its documents. When subpoenas arrived, not dramatized with sirens, but served by civil process servers in quiet rooms, the narrative shifted. A federal probe implies more than gossip. It implies consequences. Harold Thorne, who had always managed damage like a craft, suddenly found himself the subject of calls requesting documents to be preserved. He barked orders, tightened his inner circle, denied any wrongdoing.
But in his panic, mistakes were made. Hasty emails that misplaced arrogance for candor, a referral that tried to pin operations on a mid-level consultant who had the wrong bank statements. Those small slips built a ladder into the truth. The ethics hearing convened soon after, scheduled in a room lined with wood and bureaucratic light. The panel was made up of a mix of industry insiders and legal ethicists. The hearing was not a trial of criminal guilt, but an institutional reckoning. Had Elena abused charity systems? Had she knowingly accepted funds in ways that violated fiduciary duty? The Thorne family aimed to make the hearing a spectacle that implied impropriety without naming it. Elena sat with her hands folded. Ruth gripped the edge of the chair beside her and did not let go. Julian was present in a suit that made him look more solemn than he often allowed. He stayed mostly silent, offering only a small squeeze of her hand when the panel took a recess. Her lawyers asked Marie to testify. She agreed, and Mason Grant provided the chain of evidence testimony about the internal memos and the web of payments. Their arguments were methodical. They did not gesticulate for cameras. They offered paper, timestamps, and confirmed bank transfers. They read the internal Thorne memos aloud until the room was full of language that could not be leaned on. It had to be accounted for. Harold's team tried to pivot, to frame their actions as campaign management and controlled PR. They argued that they had been protecting reputations as any responsible firm might. Their language was slick and precise, and the room smelled like an old theater where roles were being played. But as the panel read through invoices and listened to a taped conversation, one that had been handed to the panel in confidence, recorded by an employee who had enough, the veneer began to chip. The taped voice was not theatrical. It was tired and small, but the words carried a corporate cruelty. Instructions to stage an event that would, quote, reduce sympathy by implying exploitation, notes about timing leaks to coincide with medical appointments, and a dismissive phrase about a target's family. The panel listened. There were faces that shifted, a murmur of disapproval in the back rows. The campaign of humiliation began to look like what it was, a deliberate project. When the panel voted, it did so not on criminality, but on institutional ethics. Their finding was advanced enough to be headline-friendly. The panel concluded there was substantial evidence that the Thorne family's affiliates had engaged in coordinated reputational attacks that violated norms and in some instances contravened donor trust protocols. It was not a slamming gavel. It was paper that would be used by prosecutors to open files. Harold's response was fury, tweeted denials, strategic absences, and a hired spokesperson who accused the panel of bias. He pushed the PR machine into overdrive.
But the federal inquiry, now with institutional confirmation from the ethics panel, was not as easily redirected. Investigation deepened. For once, documents mattered more than influence. During those months, Elena did not stop singing. She kept small concerts, recorded a set of songs that she released quietly to streaming platforms, with the proceeds directed into a fund, the Elena Vance Trust. She had chosen the name intentionally, not the surname that had been given to her through contract. The trust was designed to protect artists and people targeted by corporate retaliation, performers who had been pushed out by rumor, families whose lives had been weaponized in the press, and patients whose private health information had been leaked for leverage. She structured the trust so it could be operated transparently, with independent auditors and a board drawn from artists, ethicists, and medical advocates. The trust was not a publicity stunt. It was a functional, legal vehicle that took years to set up and cost money to run. She understood that charity needed both heart and institutional heft. Julian did not dictate the terms of the trust. He funded an initial endowment, yes, but it was Elena who chose the trustees, who insisted on an oversight committee, and who insisted that the trust be audited by a nonprofit she respected. She refused offers from big foundations that demanded excessive influence. She trusted the small, imperfect organizations who had stood by her that first Soho night. When Harold Thorne was indicted, charged with conspiracy to commit corporate harassment, falsification of records, and several counts related to corruption, the news cycle roared. It did not bring a neat conclusion. Indictments are legal statements of suspicion, not verdicts. But it shifted the moral economy of the city. A man who had always bought impunity now faced the prospect of courtroom files and depositions. The indictment did not erase the harm done to Elena over the years. It did not restore the exact chords of a past life that had been cut short. But it unmoored the assumption that reputations could be remade at will. For Elena, the legal wins were a new kind of music, procedural, uneven, but ultimately aimed at restoring a sense of accountability. Through it all, the sparing evolutions between her and Julian continued, measured and unforced. He learned, in small ways, to be quiet in rooms that needed his silence more than his directives. He learned to fetch Leo a magazine without announcing it to the world. He learned where Leo liked his pillow fluffed, and when he needed a joke rather than a clinical assessment. He began to listen to Elena describe a phrase not as a thing to be exploited for a return, but as a memory that needed tending. When she told a story about a teacher who had once given her a battered scorebook, Julian watched the way the memory warmed her and understood that not every risk could be mitigated by a spreadsheet.
There were moments that belonged to the private life they had contracted into. A morning when Elena found Julian in the music room at dawn, the city's first light turning his silhouette soft. He was playing a small, inconsequential tune, with his expression concentrated in a way he rarely allowed. The sound was hesitant and unfamiliar, but there was an earnestness to it that made Elena sit down beside him. They did not speak of futures or vows. They spoke about the way a phrase could be found again, about discipline, about little things that had weight once removed from the public sphere. In that small exchange, there was a tenderness that could not be reduced to transactions. The public romance the tabloids tried to script did not entirely materialize. There were no movie montage declarations. What grew was a slow recognition. Julian admired Elena's clarity and refusal to be reduced. Elena respected Julian's capacity to alter his strategies with human cost in mind. There was affection, but it was layered and defiant of cliché. They admitted nothing to the cameras, and the rumors about what they were to each other remained just that, rumor. The legal run of the Thorne case moved forward with long bureaucratic patience. Depositions lasted for days. A procedural misstep by a Thorne affiliate led to a discovery room raid, where boxes of documents were cataloged in public logs. The movement from rumor to record is glacial, but it bore fruit. The prosecution offered plea negotiations to mid-level operatives, who then agreed to cooperate. Journalists published stories that matched the documents Marie had provided.
Her testimony was not sensational. It was precise, personal, and anchored in the quotidian reality of caring for Leo through a chronic illness, an anchoring that made the abstract cruelty concrete. The months after the indictments were a cycle of relief and caution. Elena released a few simple recordings, a small EP uploaded without fanfare, recordings of songs she had sung in the kitchen when the radiator clanged at night. The tracks were raw, blindly recorded in a studio over 2 late nights, and they found an audience. Listeners wrote in with stories of their own small recoveries. A mother in Ohio sent a message about how one of Elena's lines had helped her comfort a child. A busker in Queens sent a video of his own cover. The music ripple effect was modest but meaningful. Elena turned these modest earnings into seed money for the trust, then called a meeting to formalize its board. The trust's first round of grants supported a small clinic that provided privacy counseling for patients and a program for young musicians who had been kicked out of conservatories because of reputational smear campaigns. Elena insisted the grants be small but consistent. She wanted to build durable support rather than symbolic checks. She wanted structures that could survive the news cycle's fickle enthusiasms. Gradually, the city shifted. The Thorne name still carried weight, but its sheen was dimmer. Institutions began to update policies on how they handled alleged improprieties, adding safeguards to prevent the kind of orchestrated harassment Elena had faced. Newspapers ran think pieces about the ethics of reputation management. The legal reforms were slow and incomplete, as legal reforms always are, but they were real and they bore Elena's mark. The final public chapter was not a courtroom or a tabloid beat, but a concert at Lincoln Center, a place that carried both her old conservatory ghosts and the city's great public music. It was not a triumphalist spectacle. Elena had insisted on an intimate program and modest ticket pricing, reserving a block of tickets for families supported by the trust. The hall filled with a careful mixture of donors and ordinary citizens. There were some journalists, but mostly there were people who had come because they had heard the recordings or had followed the slow arc of public scandal. Leo sat a few rows back, his hand wrapped in a blanket, his presence a small universe of solid fact. Ruth sat beside him, and Julian took a seat 2 rows further back. Practical distance, not absence. He did not want the cameras to mistake his watch for something he could not earn. Elena walked on stage without fanfare. The lights were soft. The orchestra was modest. She began with the Mozart aria that had once been a wager. This time she sang it as reclamation, each measure a statement of ownership. The high F that had once stunned a dining room now hung in the Lincoln Center air like an unassailable assertion.
When she sang, the hall listened without the calculus of status. She felt the weave of presence around her, a human warmth that had no ledger. Midway through the set, she set aside the arias and chose a small, unadorned song she had written months earlier in the penthouse, a lullaby borrowed from a Russian folk tune she had sung to Leo as a child. The melody was simple. Her voice, now weathered and precise, carried it like a torch. In the rows, people lifted their faces with small tears and little smiles. Children from the trust held handmade signs that read, "Sing for us, and thank you, Elena." The sight made her throat close, and the phrase she had used in so many private rehearsals, "sing for someone," felt public and holy. When she finished, the applause was long, but not the jagged roar of tabloids. It was clear. People stood, some with fists pressed against their chests, as if feeling for the exact place in themselves that had been touched. Julian's hands came together, and he rose last, his applause steady and deliberate. He did not cross the stage. He watched, eyes fixed on her, as if memorizing the arc of a phrase. Afterwards, she moved through the crowd with the measured grace of someone who had learned to be careful with herself. She stopped to speak to families, to sign small programs, to take the kind of steady photographs that do not feel like performances. Leo hugged her with an intimacy that belonged to the two of them, then slid into the doorway with Ruth to catch a breath of evening. That night, in a small room that smelled faintly of concert dust and lemon, Julian found Elena by the water cooler and handed her a small, plain envelope. She opened it to find a press clipping from years back, a review from a conservatory recital, the critic's words praising her phrasing, folded like a small relic. No pendant this time, no performative gift, just paper and a careful return to origins. "You carried the city for a while," he said, voice low, as if neither wanted their private life to be translated into headline language. She looked at him and did not for once negotiate. "You carried me," she said simply. He smiled. "A small, private thing. We carried each other in the only way we know how." There was no grand vow spoken in the corridor of that hall. They stood under corridor lights, two people who had agreed on terms, and who had done the thing that might have been impossible, kept the other human. It was not a love story wrapped neatly in ribbon. Consent, boundaries, and the contract they had signed remained part of the landscape. But there was now a shared axis of respect and choice. They had built an arrangement that had begun as protection, and had, through the slow accrual of attention and mutual witness, become something closer to partnership. The Elena Vance Trust continued to operate with the quietness of hard work, grant applications, oversight meetings, piano lessons with subsidized teachers.
The Trust's first mentorship program sent a small group of young musicians to workshops where they learned not only craft, but also how to protect themselves from reputation assaults. Elena appeared sometimes in class, more teacher than celebrity, showing how a phrase could be shaped and how a line could be turned into a shield. There were nights when the old shame flared, when cameras dug into old rumor and tried to resurrect it. But the city had changed small things. The conversation about privacy had matured. Voters and donors asked more questions. Institutions had to answer. The Thorne influence, while still present, could not always move stealthily through rooms without detection. Julian's evolution did not stop. He still made decisions with a mind tuned to leverage, but he had learned to consider human cost in a way he had not before. He contributed, quietly, to reforms that bolstered patient privacy protections and strengthened nonprofit accountability. People close to him noticed he lingered longer when Leo told a story. He learned to listen without filing for advantage. Elena released more music, recordings of songs she had kept private for years, a small album she titled in Russian as a nod to the first songs her mother had hummed in kitchen light. She chose to release it not with a global marketing blitz, but on a slow, steady schedule, with proceeds funneled into the trust. The records were thin on shimmer and heavy on truth. They found a modest audience that sat with the music rather than devoured it. In the months that followed, the city adjusted. Harold Thorne faced more hearings and the protracted grind of legal defense. The indictment did not make him disappear from the social pages, but it made his compliments sound hollow in rooms that once accepted them without question. Isabella retreated, not from influence, but from the light of sustained scrutiny. The campaign of humiliation that had once seemed like a minor social sport was now an object lesson in consequence. One crisp winter evening, Elena found herself teaching a small group of kids at a community center, the piano bench worn and familiar. She watched as a girl in the front row bent a note into place with a determined face, as if rearranging the world through a phrase. The girl's mother had once been a target of a small rumor in a local election. The trust had helped her keep her job and rebuild confidence. The sight made Elena think of the chain of small choices that had led them here. A dare in a dining room, a viral clip, a contract signed under fluorescent lights, a trust founded in the quiet insistence that dignity matters. Julian came in late to the class and stood at the back, hands folded, watching. He did not speak much. He just watched as faces turned toward the music. When the lesson ended, he stayed for a while to talk to the mothers, to listen to their stories without the urge to fix them with a check or a press release.
He had learned that sometimes presence was currency. Their marriage, by then beyond the 1-year mark, remained a negotiated terrain. They renewed parts of the contract with clearer clauses specifying privacy and boundaries. Julian proposed a modification that would allow Elena to take formal control over the trust's public voice, and she accepted. It was an important transfer of agency, one that sealed the trust's independence. It was not the romantic consummation the tabloids had wished for. It was a legal and moral rectification that ensured Elena would not be framed as merely the house's charitable face. In a small, private ceremony that mattered to them rather than to anyone else, they rewrote the specifics that had initially created the arrangement. The changes honored Elena's autonomy and codified protections for Leo. It was in its way a quiet reordering of the original bargain into something closer to an equal partnership. They did not proclaim love in cinematic phrases. Instead, they agreed in legal language to share decision-making where it mattered. As the city turned and seasons shifted, Elena found herself performing again and again, not to impress patrons or to be rescued by headlines,
but to make music that could be a shelter for others. She taught master classes, sat on panels about privacy and ethics, and quietly funded scholarships for students who might otherwise be pushed out of music by smear campaigns. She spoke at forums about the human cost of reputational warfare and the responsibility institutions had to protect people. When she performed later at Lincoln Center for a benefit that raised funds for the First Trust cohort, she did so with a new kind of calm. She walked on stage to see Leo in the front row, Ruth beside him, and Julian in the fifth row, present, not performative. Children from the trust stood in the lobby, clutching handmade signs and small drawings that thanked her for music lessons. Elena's voice that night moved in tones that acknowledged loss but did not surrender to it. The final note of her set, a long-held phrase, seemed to give the hall something to think about. It was not a victory cry. It was the soft insistence that someone is here, and they will not be erased. After the performance, in a narrow corridor away from the press, Julian took her hand. He did not kneel. He did not offer vows. Instead, he said, "You will always be Elena Vance, not a headline." She looked at him, and for a moment, they were not defined by contracts or headlines. They were two people who had shared a space in which agency and care had been traded with mutual respect. Her fingers, still scented faintly with the perfume of the concert hall, twined through his. There was no tidy resolution to everything. The Thorne case would linger in courts. Reputation is a brittle thing, and the trust would always be beset by the need for funds and careful stewardship.
But in the small domestic world they had built, there was movement towards something generous. Years later, the trust's name would appear on small programs and municipal panels. Young musicians who had been forced out of conservatories returned to stage and classroom. Leo, whose health remained fragile and unpredictable, grew used to being a steady presence in a world that had learned, slowly and painfully, to respect privacy. He took piano lessons because a lifetime with Elena had given him a small appetite for sound. He laughed sometimes, a sound that stayed with Elena like a chorus. On a late spring evening, at a small community performance funded by the trust, children holding paper flowers and parents holding thermoses gathered around a modest stage in a local park. Julian sat in the back, his coat loosened, and watched Elena center the room with a lullaby she had sung since the day she and Leo had learned to make a life from small things. As she sang, a breeze moved through the crowd and lifted the paper flowers like a slow, harmless gale. When the song finished, the applause was not about the billionaire at the back or the indictment miles away. It was about something simpler, a woman who had reclaimed a voice and chosen to let it belong to others. Julian walked forward and stood beside her, not to claim her, but to offer a hand that said, "We share this ground now." They did not promise a future of cinematic devotion. They promised in the grammar of their lives to hold one another's humanity steady. The marriage that began as a calculated instrument had evolved into an arrangement that respected both constraints and capacities. Love, if it existed between them, arrived as a gradual companion, shown in small gestures, in the choice to stay when staying was costly, in the willingness to let agency remain with its rightful holder. Elena's music continued to circulate, sometimes in small cafes and sometimes on the benches of subway platforms where buskers played the same tunes she had once hummed alone. The trust continued to grant modest funds, and people wrote to say their lives had shifted in small, tangible ways. Not all harms were undone. Reputations do not stitch easily, but the city had been altered in minor, decisive ways. Institutions asked harder questions, donors demanded transparency, and the idea that power could crush without consequence had been dented. On a quiet afternoon many months later, Julian handed Elena the broken music note pendant, the one he had once placed on her desk, now repaired and worn on a chain. He did not speak in grand phrases. He looked at her with a steadiness that had grown out of watching her refuse erasure and maintain dignity. "For the sound you built into the world," he said. She accepted the pendant, and in the movement of fingers, his hand brushed hers. It was not a claim. It was a shared gratitude. The gesture was small, private, and enough. They continued to keep many things in careful language, clauses, privacy limits, and a public face that refused to be a spectacle. Their partnership lived in the unflashy ways of shared appointments, hospital visits at odd hours, and the exchange of small kindnesses that meant everything. And in the evenings when the city unfurled itself in light and distant sirens, Elena sometimes sat at the piano and sang, not to win a heart, but because singing was how she lived. The Mozart aria that had begun as a wager remained a hinge in her story, but it was no longer the axis of her life. It had opened doors and shown what voices could do. After that, she had taught herself to choose where to walk through them. If Elena's voice moved you, subscribe for more stories like this and tell us which line stayed with you.